The moment you realize someone doesn't value you is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with a slammed door or a dramatic goodbye. Sometimes it comes wrapped in laughter beneath crystal chandeliers while everyone else in the room smiles. I learned that on a cold October evening overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The wind rattled the tall windows of Blackwater Estate as waves crashed against the cliffs nearly 100 feet below. From the outside, the mansion looked like something out of a magazine. White stone walls, perfect gardens, warm golden light spilling from every window. People often called it a castle. Adrien hated that word. He preferred empire. Tonight, his empire was hosting one of the most exclusive charity galas in Newport. Politicians, investors, business leaders, people who arrived in tailored suits and evening gowns worth more than my first car. I stood near the grand staircase with a practiced smile, greeting guests as they entered the ballroom. 17 years of marriage had taught me how to disappear elegantly, how to stand beside a powerful man without taking up too much space, how to make everyone comfortable while asking for nothing in return. "Mrs. Moretti, the flowers are beautiful," one guest told me. "Thank you," I replied. "You always make these events feel special." I smiled politely. If only she knew I'd spent 3 weeks planning every detail, while Adrien spent less than 10 minutes approving the budget. The orchestra played softly from the balcony above. Servers moved through the crowd carrying silver trays. Laughter floated through the room like music. Everything looked perfect. That's what I was good at, making things look perfect. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped onto the second-floor gallery overlooking the ballroom. I needed a moment alone, just 60 seconds to breathe. Below me, Adrien stood surrounded by a circle of wealthy donors. Even from a distance, he commanded attention effortlessly. At 37, Adrien Moretti had the kind of presence that made people stop talking when he entered a room. Tall, confident, impossibly composed. The sort of man who never appeared uncertain about anything. One of the investors raised a glass toward him. "Adrien, you've built quite a life for yourself." More laughter followed. Someone asked how he managed to balance such a demanding career with marriage. I wasn't paying much attention at first. Then I heard my name. "Evelyn," Adrien chuckled. "Trust me, that's the easiest part of my life." The group laughed politely. My stomach tightened. Another man grinned. "What's your secret?" Adrien took a sip of whiskey. "The only thing my wife has to do is show up." More laughter, louder this time. "That's it?" someone asked. Adrien shrugged. "Pretty much. Everything else is handled." The men laughed again. Glasses clinked. Smiles widened. Nobody noticed the woman standing above them. Nobody noticed her fingers tightening around the balcony railing. Nobody noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. But I noticed because I was the woman. For a moment, the entire ballroom blurred. The music continued. Conversations carried on. Somewhere below, guests danced beneath sparkling lights. Yet all I could hear was that single sentence repeating itself inside my head. "The only thing my wife has to do is show up." I looked around the room I had spent months preparing. The event he would proudly take credit for tomorrow. The foundation partnerships I organized. The donors I cultivated. The families we helped through programs nobody knew I funded personally. Show up. Was that really all he thought I did? A server passed nearby and offered me a glass of champagne. I accepted it automatically. My hand trembled slightly. The pale gold liquid shimmered beneath the lights. I forced myself to smile because that was what I always did. Down below, Adrien continued entertaining his guests, confident, admired, completely unaware that something fragile had just cracked inside the woman who loved him. And for the first time in 7 years, as I stood alone above the empire we had built together, I found myself wondering a dangerous question. If all I do is show up, what would happen if one day I didn't? I barely slept that night. The Atlantic winds rattled the windows of Blackwater Estate long after the last guest had gone home. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard the laughter again. Not because it was cruel. That would have been easier to understand. It was casual, effortless, as if my existence had been reduced to a decorative detail in a life I had spent years helping build. By 6 in the morning, I was already downstairs. The mansion was quiet except for the distant hum of the kitchen. Mrs. Donnelly, our head chef, looked up from a tray of fresh pastries and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Mrs. Moretti." "Good morning, Nora." She relaxed immediately. Everyone did. That was something I had never fully noticed until much later. The house staff did not straighten when Adrien entered a room. They respected him. But when they came to me, they exhaled. They told me about sick parents, college applications, worried children, and broken water heaters. Somehow, I had become the person who listened. By 7 o'clock, I was reviewing schedules with the estate manager, approving repairs to the greenhouse roof, finalizing transportation for a charity fundraiser next month, and answering 3 emails from scholarship recipients. None of those tasks appeared under my name. Most people assumed assistants handled them. I had stopped correcting them years ago. Around 8:30, Adrien walked into the breakfast room wearing a charcoal suit. His dark hair was still damp from the shower. His attention was already on his phone. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." He kissed my cheek without looking up. The gesture was familiar, automatic. He poured coffee and scanned market reports while I reviewed invoices from one of our foundation partners. For several minutes, silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just practiced. "The gala was successful," he finally said. Everyone seemed impressed. I nodded. "That is good." He smiled slightly. "You always make these events run smoothly." The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Before I could respond, his phone rang. A business call, another meeting, another day. Within 2 minutes, he was gone. The chair across from me sat empty. I stared at it longer than I should have. Later that afternoon, I drove into Newport to visit Harbor Light Community Center, a small brick building near the waterfront. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would ever appear in a magazine profile about Adrien Moretti. Yet, the moment I stepped inside, a dozen voices greeted me. Children ran across the gymnasium. Volunteers waved from the front desk. A teenage girl rushed over carrying a college acceptance letter. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged me. "I got in," she whispered. "I actually got in." My heart swelled. I knew you would. Nobody there cared about designer gowns or charity galas. They cared about opportunities, school supplies, mentorship programs, safe places to grow. Things Adrien funded generously, but rarely saw firsthand. As I watched the students laughing together, I realized something strange. For the first time in months, I felt visible. Not because anyone was praising me, not because they knew how much work happened behind the scenes, simply because I mattered there. When evening came, I returned to Blackwater Estate. The mansion glowed against the darkening coastline. Beautiful, impressive, majestic. Yet as I stood in the driveway staring at the illuminated windows, a thought quietly settled into my heart. Everyone inside believed Adrien was the center of this world. Even Adrien believed it. And perhaps that was the real problem. Because nobody had noticed the woman standing beside him all these years. Not even the man who promised to love her forever. 3 days later, I found myself standing inside the estate's Victorian greenhouse, while rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling above me. The air smelled of jasmine and damp earth. It had always been my favorite place on the property. Long before the galas, long before the headlines, long before Blackwater Estate became a symbol of Adrien's success. Back when it was simply a home we dreamed about building together. I ran my fingers along the leaves of a climbing rose and tried to remember when exactly things had changed. The frightening truth was that I could not. There had been no single argument, no dramatic betrayal, just years of small moments accumulating quietly between us. Years of being appreciated without being seen. My phone vibrated. Another message from the foundation director. Another request for approval. Another problem solved before anyone else realized it existed. I answered it automatically. Then another arrived from the scholarship committee. Then one from the estate manager regarding next month's budget projections. By noon, I had resolved 6 different issues affecting organizations connected to our family. Nobody would ever know. Nobody was supposed to know. That was the arrangement I had accepted long ago. Yet something felt different now, as if a curtain had been pulled back and I could no longer unsee what stood behind it. Later that afternoon, Adrien returned from Boston after a series of meetings. I watched his black sedan roll through the front gates from the greenhouse window. Staff members immediately began preparing for his arrival. Calls were made, schedules adjusted, dinner plans confirmed. The entire estate shifted around his presence, like planets orbiting a sun. 20 minutes later, he stepped into the greenhouse carrying 2 cups of coffee. "There you are," he said with a smile. "I have been looking everywhere." I accepted the cup. "Thank you." He sat beside me on a wooden bench overlooking the ocean cliffs beyond the glass walls. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than usual. "You seem distant lately," he finally said. I stared into my coffee. "Do I?" "You do." His voice softened. "Is something wrong?" The question should have comforted me. Instead, it hurt, because I realized he genuinely did not know. He had not connected that night at the gala to the woman sitting beside him now. In his mind, nothing had happened. The world had continued exactly as before. "Everything is fine," I said quietly. The words tasted like a lie. Adrien nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he began discussing a new expansion project, a luxury marina acquisition, investor partnerships, economic forecasts. I listened politely, contributed where necessary, asked intelligent questions. The same role I had played for years. Yet while he spoke, my eyes drifted toward the greenhouse entrance, toward the path leading back to the mansion, toward the life waiting for me beyond these walls. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if I stopped solving every problem? What if I stopped filling every gap before anyone noticed it existed? What if I simply stepped back? The idea frightened me, not because of what would happen to Adrien, but because I was no longer sure who I would be without carrying everyone else's burdens. That evening, after dinner, I walked through the mansion alone, past the library, past the ballroom, past hallways, lined with photographs documenting a life that looked perfect from the outside. In nearly every picture, Adrien stood at the center, smiling, celebrated, admired, and beside him stood a woman whose name most people barely remembered after introductions ended. I stopped in front of one frame and studied it for a long moment. Then I whispered something I had never allowed myself to say before. "I am tired." The words echoed softly through the empty hallway. Not physically tired, not the kind sleep could fix. I was tired of disappearing, tired of shrinking myself so other people could shine, tired of carrying responsibilities that nobody acknowledged because they assumed they happened by magic. And for the first time since marrying Adrien Moretti, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I was no longer invisible. The possibility felt terrifying, but it also felt like freedom. The decision was not made in a moment of anger. That is what people always get wrong about leaving. They imagine slammed doors and raised voices. They imagine dramatic confrontations. My decision arrived quietly on a gray Thursday morning, while fog drifted across the Atlantic and the lighthouse beyond the cliffs disappeared into the mist. I was sitting alone in the library at Blackwater Estate, with a notebook open in front of me. The grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the fireplace. Somewhere downstairs, staff members prepared breakfast. The house felt alive, comfortable, familiar, and for the first time it no longer felt like mine. I stared at a blank page for nearly 20 minutes before writing a single sentence, then another, then another. The words came slowly because there was no hatred behind them, only sadness. 7 years of marriage could not be reduced to accusations. Adrien had not been cruel. He had not betrayed me. The truth was somehow harder to explain. He had stopped seeing me, or perhaps he had never fully seen me at all. By noon, I had folded the letter and placed it inside a plain white envelope. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I expected tears. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as if some part of me had already crossed a bridge long before my body caught up. The next few hours passed in silence. I answered emails, approved scholarship requests, returned phone calls, finished every outstanding responsibility connected to the foundation. Years of habit refused to disappear overnight. Shortly before sunset, I walked through the estate one final time. I visited the greenhouse where I had spent countless mornings. I paused in the ballroom where hundreds of guests had celebrated beneath crystal chandeliers. I stood on the ocean terrace and listened to waves crashing against the rocks below. Every corner held memories, some beautiful, some painful, most of them ordinary, the kind that quietly become a life. When I returned to our bedroom, golden evening light spilled across the hardwood floors. Adrien's side of the room remained untouched. He was in Manhattan attending meetings and would not return until late. Part of me was grateful. I was not sure I could have explained this face to face. I opened the top drawer of my dresser and removed my wedding ring. The diamond caught the fading sunlight. For several seconds, I simply stared at it, resting in my palm. 7 years, thousands of mornings, thousands of conversations, dreams built together, promises made sincerely. I pressed my eyes closed. Then I placed the ring beside the envelope on the nightstand. Nothing dramatic, no speeches, no ultimatums. Just a ring and a letter. I packed one suitcase, clothes, personal documents, a few photographs, the essentials. Everything else remained exactly where it belonged. By the time darkness settled over Newport, I was standing at the front entrance with my coat draped over one arm. Mrs. Donnelly appeared from the hallway and froze when she saw the suitcase. Her expression changed immediately. Concern, confusion, heartbreak. "Mrs. Moretti," she whispered. I forced a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Nora." Tears filled her eyes. Mine almost did too. Almost. A few minutes later, a car carried me away from Blackwater Estate. The mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror with every passing mile. White stone walls, golden lights, the life everyone thought I could never leave. I watched until the estate disappeared completely beyond the darkness. Then I looked forward. My phone remained silent. Adrien had not called. He did not know I was gone yet, but resting on the nightstand beside our bed was a letter containing the truth I had spent years swallowing. And for the first time since becoming Evelyn Moretti, I was no longer driving toward someone else's future. I was finally driving toward my own. Adrien found the letter at 11:47 that night. I know the exact time because he told me later. The digital clock beside our bed glowed softly in the darkness as he walked into an empty room, expecting an ordinary evening. Instead, he found silence. My suitcase was gone. My side of the closet was half empty, and resting on the nightstand sat an envelope beside a wedding ring he had not seen off my finger in 7 years. By the time I woke the next morning in a small waterfront town nearly 40 miles north of Newport, I already had 12 missed calls, 8 texts, 3 voicemails. I did not listen to any of them. Outside my window, fishing boats drifted across the harbor beneath a pale sunrise. For the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. The feeling should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. Back at Blackwater Estate, life continued. At least that was what Adrien assumed. He had spent years believing systems simply worked. Meetings happened. Events succeeded. Problems disappeared. The machine kept moving forward. What he did not understand was that I had been the invisible hand keeping it running. The first crack appeared 2 days later. A charity board meeting was canceled because critical documents had not been prepared. Then a donor called asking why nobody had returned her messages. Then one of the estate managers submitted his resignation after accepting a position elsewhere. Adrien handled each issue individually, annoyed but unconcerned. Yet by the end of the week, the problems multiplied. Vendors stopped receiving approvals, scholarship applications sat untouched, event schedules overlapped, deadlines slipped. Small mistakes began appearing everywhere. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to create friction, just enough to make people uneasy. One afternoon, Adrien walked into his office expecting to finalize plans for a major fundraiser. Instead, he found 3 frustrated executives arguing over details that should have been settled weeks earlier. "Why is this still unresolved?" he demanded. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one woman cleared her throat. Mrs. Moretti usually handled these situations. The room fell silent. Adrien dismissed the comment at first, yet over the next several days, he heard similar versions everywhere. Mrs. Moretti usually took care of this. Mrs. Moretti already had a system for that. Mrs. Moretti knew the answer. The words followed him through conference rooms, offices, and hallways like echoes. Meanwhile, I spent my mornings walking along the harbor. The salty air carried the scent of the ocean. Seagulls circled above fishing docks. Nobody recognized my last name there. Nobody cared who my husband was. For the first time in a very long time, I existed as Evelyn Harper rather than Evelyn Moretti. The difference felt strange, liberating, and heartbreaking all at once. One evening, I sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the water when my phone rang again. Adrien. The screen glowed in the fading sunset. I stared at his name for several seconds before letting the call go unanswered. Moments later, a voicemail arrived. Then another. Then a third. I listened to none of them. Yet something told me the man leaving those messages was beginning to experience something entirely new. Not loneliness. Not yet. Awareness. Because for the first time in 7 years, Adrien Moretti was discovering how many parts of his world carried my fingerprints. And for the first time in 7 years, those fingerprints were gone. 2 weeks after I left, Adrien stopped asking where I was and started asking who I had been. There is a difference. One question comes from panic. The other comes from discovery. I learned that later. from people who still worked at Blackwater Estate. The first revelation arrived during a foundation audit. Adrien had scheduled the review expecting routine numbers and familiar reports. Instead, he found pages upon pages carrying my notes, my approvals, my recommendations, and my signatures. Entire programs existed because I had fought for them. Hundreds of students had received scholarships because I had personally interviewed candidates. Community centers had remained open because I negotiated funding gaps nobody else even noticed. For years, the accomplishments had quietly carried the Moretti name. Yet behind nearly every success stood a woman nobody bothered to credit. The discovery unsettled him, not because of pride, but because of confusion. One afternoon, he drove to Harbor Light Community Center, the same building I had visited countless times near the waterfront. Children were finishing after-school activities when he arrived. Volunteers greeted him politely, but their excitement faded when they realized he had come alone. "Where is Evelyn?" a young girl asked immediately. Adrien blinked. "She is not with me." The disappointment on the child's face struck him harder than he expected. Throughout the afternoon, it happened again and again. Teachers asked about me. Parents asked about me. Volunteers asked about me. One elderly man shook Adrien's hand and said, "Your wife changed my grandson's life." Another woman thanked him for supporting the literacy program. Then she smiled softly and added, "Evelyn never missed a single event. Every conversation seemed to lead back to the same person. Me, the invisible wife, the woman who supposedly only showed up." Meanwhile, I rented a small cottage overlooking Narragansett Bay. It was nothing like Blackwater Estate, no staff, no grand staircases, no crystal chandeliers, just white walls, weathered hardwood floors, and a front porch facing the water. I loved it immediately. Every morning, I carried coffee outside and watched fishing boats drift across the horizon. The silence no longer felt lonely, it felt honest. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. Then one rainy Thursday evening, my phone rang again. Adrien. I stared at the screen while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the harbor. The call ended. A voicemail appeared seconds later. This time curiosity won. I pressed play. His voice filled the room, tired, slower than usual. "Evelyn, I went to Harbor Light today." A long pause followed. I did not know. Another pause. "I keep finding pieces of your life everywhere." His voice grew quieter, and I am realizing how little I actually understood about what you carried. I closed my eyes. The rain tapped gently against the windows. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, even though the message had already been recorded days earlier. Then his voice returned, softer than I had ever heard it. I thought I knew my own world. Another pause. "Now I am beginning to understand that most of it was held together by you." The message ended. Silence settled around me. Outside, the storm continued moving across the bay. Inside, I stared at the dark phone resting in my hands. For the first time since leaving, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just the faint realization that Adrien Moretti had finally started seeing the woman who had been standing beside him all along. 3 weeks after I left, the storm finally arrived. Not the kind that rolled in from the Atlantic with dark clouds and crashing waves. This storm wore expensive suits, carried contracts, and arrived disguised as opportunity. I first heard about it through a former colleague from the foundation. A major partnership that Adrien had spent nearly a year negotiating was beginning to unravel. Key donors were frustrated. Community leaders felt ignored. Communication had broken down across multiple organizations. Nothing catastrophic had happened, yet trust, once damaged, has a way of spreading cracks through everything it touches. The strange part was that none of those relationships had originally belonged to Adrien. Most of them had been mine. Years earlier, I had built them one conversation at a time. One meeting, one promise kept, one handwritten thank you note. The people involved trusted the Moretti name because they trusted the woman standing quietly beside it. Now that woman was gone. One afternoon, I received a call from Harbor Light. The director sounded worried. Funding for a youth initiative had suddenly become uncertain because several negotiations were stalled. I listened carefully, asked questions, and promised to think about possible solutions. After ending the call, I sat on my porch overlooking Narragansett Bay. The wind carried the scent of salt water. Whitecaps danced across the surface beneath a gray sky. For nearly an hour, I stared at the horizon, wrestling with a difficult truth. I had left because I needed to stop disappearing, but innocent people were now being affected by problems they did not create. Children, students, families, the same people I had spent years trying to help. That evening, Adrien appeared at my cottage. He did not call first. He did not send a message. I saw his black sedan pull into the gravel driveway just before sunset. My pulse quickened instantly, not from fear, but from uncertainty. When he stepped out of the car, I barely recognized him. The perfectly composed man from Blackwater Estates seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. His shoulders carried a weight I had never seen before. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The ocean wind moved between us. Finally, Adrien broke the silence. Everything is falling apart. His voice was quiet, honest. There was no arrogance left in it, no certainty, no performance, just exhaustion. I looked at him carefully. The businesses? He shook his head. Not the businesses. His eyes met mine, the people. Something inside me softened despite myself. Adrien stepped closer. I spent years believing leadership meant being the person everyone depended on. He laughed bitterly. Then you left and I discovered that most of those people depended on you. The confession hung between us, raw, uncomfortable, real. I folded my arms against the cool evening air. What do you want from me? For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then he answered with a truth I never expected to hear. I want you to know that I finally understand what I lost. The wind stirred my hair. Waves crashed softly against distant rocks. Somewhere above us, gulls circled through the fading light. Adrien lowered his gaze briefly before speaking again. I thought I built an empire. His voice cracked slightly. But now I realize I never understood who was holding it together. For the first time since leaving Blackwater Estate, I saw no trace of the man who laughed beneath crystal chandeliers. Standing before me was someone entirely different, someone humbled by absence. Someone learning that power means very little when the person who gave your life meaning is no longer standing beside you. For a long time after Adrien left that evening, I remained on the porch, watching darkness settle across Narragansett Bay. The water reflected scattered lights from distant boats. The wind had grown colder. Yet my thoughts remained fixed on the man who had stood in my driveway, looking more lost than I had ever seen him. A week passed before I saw him again. During that time, something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to convince me to come home, Adrien started fixing the problems himself, not by issuing orders, not by writing checks. He showed up. Harbor Light called to tell me he attended volunteer meetings. Scholarship coordinators mentioned he spent hours listening to students describe their goals. Community leaders who once only spoke to me began receiving personal visits from him. The stories reached me one by one. At first, I dismissed them, then curiosity replaced skepticism. One Saturday morning, I drove into Newport for a charity event I had helped organize months earlier. The gathering took place in a renovated community center overlooking the harbor. Families filled the courtyard. Children chased one another between tables decorated with handmade crafts. Music drifted through the warm autumn air. I arrived quietly, hoping to remain unnoticed. Instead, the moment I stepped inside, people began greeting me. Hugs, smiles, questions about how I had been. Familiar faces surrounded me from every direction. For the first time in weeks, I felt overwhelmed, not by responsibility, but by affection. Then I saw Adrien. He stood near a booth helping volunteers distribute school supplies. No expensive suit, no entourage, just rolled up sleeves and a stack of boxes. For several seconds, I simply watched. He looked up unexpectedly. Our eyes met across the courtyard. Neither of us moved. The noise around us seemed to fade. Eventually, he walked toward me, slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a fragile bridge he hoped would hold. "Hello, Evelyn." His voice carried none of its old certainty. "Hello, Adrien." A brief silence followed. Then he surprised me by reaching into his jacket and pulling out a folded sheet of paper. "There is something I need to say." I stared at him. "You wrote it down?" He nodded, because I did not trust myself to say it correctly. The answer caught me off guard. Adrien unfolded the paper with slightly trembling hands. Then he looked directly at me. Not through me, not around me, at me. "I spent years believing success meant being admired," he began quietly. "I believed leadership meant standing in front of everyone." His voice wavered. "What I failed to understand is that the strongest person in my life was standing beside me." My throat tightened. Around us, the event continued. Laughter, conversations, music. Yet in that moment, there were only two people in the world. Adrien lowered the paper. His eyes glistened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Then in front of volunteers, community leaders, and dozens of strangers, the man who once seemed larger than life did something nobody expected. He lowered himself onto one knee, not because of tradition, not because of spectacle, because humility was the only language left. The courtyard fell silent. Adrien looked up at me and whispered words I had waited years to hear. "I am sorry for seeing your presence, but never seeing you." And for the first time since leaving Blackwater Estate, I believed he finally understood the difference. The strange thing about healing is that it rarely happens all at once. There was no dramatic reunion, no perfect speech capable of erasing years of being overlooked. Life does not work that way. Trust returns one choice at a time. Respect returns one action at a time. Love, if it survives, returns one day at a time. After the charity event, I did not move back to Blackwater Estate. Not immediately. Instead, Adrien and I began meeting for coffee along the waterfront. Long conversations replaced assumptions. Questions replaced certainty. For the first time in our marriage, he wanted to know who I was beyond the role I played in his life. He asked about the scholarship students whose names I remembered by heart. He asked why Harbor Light meant so much to me. He asked what dreams I had set aside over the years. And for the first time, I answered honestly. Winter arrived along the Rhode Island coast. Snow dusted the rooftops. Fishing boats rocked gently against frozen docks. The world seemed quieter somehow. One afternoon, nearly 4 months after I left, Adrien invited me back to Blackwater Estate. Not to return, just to visit. As my car climbed the familiar road overlooking the ocean, memories rushed toward me from every direction. The white stone walls, the gardens, the towering windows facing the Atlantic. Yet, something felt different before I even stepped inside. The front doors opened. Staff members greeted me warmly. Mrs. Donnelly immediately pulled me into a hug. Tears filled her eyes, mine too. Then I noticed the plaque mounted beside the entrance hall. Simple, elegant, new. The Evelyn Harper Community Initiative. I stared at the name in silence. Adrien stepped beside me. "The scholarship program needed a permanent home," he said quietly, "and it should carry the name of the person who built it." Emotion tightened my throat. For years, my work had existed in the shadows, not because anyone forced it there, but because I had allowed myself to disappear. Adrien had finally changed that. Later that evening, we stood together on the ocean terrace, overlooking the cliffs. Waves crashed against the rocks nearly 100 feet below. The winter wind carried the scent of salt and possibility. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then Adrien reached into his coat pocket and removed something small. My wedding ring. He held it carefully in his palm, not offering it, not demanding anything, simply holding it. "I kept this with me every day," he admitted, "not because I expected you to come back." His voice softened, "because I needed to remember what I almost lost." Tears blurred my vision, not from sadness, but from understanding. The man standing beside me was not the same man who left beneath crystal chandeliers months ago. That man believed love would always remain where he left it. This man understood that love must be honored, protected, and seen. Slowly, I took the ring from his hand. The ocean roared below us. The sky stretched endlessly above. And somewhere between the woman who walked away and the man who learned how to look beyond himself, a new beginning quietly appeared. Years later, people would still call Adrien Moretti a king. They would still admire the empire he built, the estate, the businesses, the influence. But they would never know the truth that mattered most. Empires are built from stone, money, and ambition. Homes are built from something else entirely. And in the end, the greatest lesson of our story was simple. He thought I only needed to show up. Then life taught him that I was the reason everything worth coming home to existed at all.